Good morning, I'm Adam Sexton. In 2016, Donald Trump became the first American president elected without any prior government or military experience. That outsider trend could continue, but in a decidedly different direction on policy and tone if voters get behind the best-selling author and presidential candidate, Marianne Williamson, who is our guest here this Sunday morning. We appreciate you coming in.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So it's clear that your fame is an asset. People come to see you because they know you and they know your books. What do you say to voters who are suspicious, though, of the idea of having another quote-unquote celebrity president?
Well, first of all, celebrity president, I mean, politicians who are well known, that's a form of celebrity as well. And I think, as you said, the fact that someone has an audience is part of why they have an opportunity to do this to begin with. I think that the fact that I have written books, the fact that I have a 35-year career, which I'm really out there, is an asset. That's why I'm doing this. I've worked for 35 years helping people navigate the consequences of what has sometimes been very damaging, irresponsible behavior on the part of the political establishment. That's why I'm running. I realize that changing trauma to transformation is not just an issue in an individual's life, but particularly right now in our nation's life. Our nation is traumatized. And all that a nation is a group of people. Part of what's wrong, part of what's inadequate in the conversation of the dominant political system is that it does not factor in the deeper emotional and psychological and spiritual realities of people. That's why both Republicans and Democrats were gobsmacked in the last presidential election by populist candidates. They weren't registering the level of economic despair so many people were experiencing. It's why we were gobsmacked by terrorism. We weren't registering the importance of the hate that people were feeling. This campaign is tapping into the love that people are feeling. Just as some have harnessed fear for political purposes, we're harnessing love for political purposes. And it's the only thing that can counter that fear. We have racism, bigotry, anti-Semitism, homophobia, Islamophobia that has been harnessed for political purposes. And I'm harnessing love and compassion, forgiveness, mercy, brotherhood, and justice for political purposes. That's, to me, what we should be doing in this country.
Parallel to being an author, you've been an activist as well, among the first to get out there and really address the AIDS crisis. Explain your activism there in Los Angeles in the earliest days, when people would not even go near that issue.
Well, my work has been in the field of spirituality and personal transformation. And every spiritual and religious tradition has as its core the message of being there for those who suffer. There's no spiritual or religious path that gives any of us a pass on addressing the suffering of other sentient beings. So how can you talk about spirituality and love and then have all these people with AIDS who, at that time, particularly when the crisis was such that the contracting the virus was an automatic death sentence at that time. So how could you be about love and a practice of love and not be there for the suffering AIDS patient? But that's the exact same impulse and the exact same motivation of my presidential campaign. It's like, could we talk about the fact that millions of American children live in chronic trauma? Could we talk about the fact that we do more to prepare for war and so little in comparison to wage peace? These spiritual and moral principles that make life important, that make us an ethical person, are what make us a moral and ethical nation. And I believe that those principles, if they apply anywhere, they apply everywhere, and that means politics as well.
You've been all about this harmony and healing in your professional career, but on the international stage, it can be a lot more Hobbesian, to borrow a philosophical term there. Hobbesian, the idea that it's the state of nature. You have self-interested nations, there's power, there's force, and that's a lot of times what carries the day on the international stage. How do you translate what you're doing into dealing with dictators who aren't going to be speaking on that plane?
Well, darkness only gets in if you didn't fill the house with light first. And so, as Donald Rumsfeld, who was the Secretary of Defense under George Bush, said, we have to wage peace. And General Mattis said, if you don't fully fund the State Department, I'm going to have to buy more ammunition. What these men were talking about was the fact that while, of course, we have to be prepared for war if war is necessary. Of course we have to have a strong military. And of course we have to deal with the fact that some people just hate us. And we have to do what we have to do to protect our homeland, to protect our people, and to protect our allies. At the same time, you can't just take medicine, you have to cultivate health. So you can't just prepare for war, you have to cultivate peace. And that you do by expanding economic opportunities for women, reducing violence against women, expanding educational opportunities for children, and diminishing human suffering wherever possible. Is diet unimportant? Is lifestyle unimportant? Is exercise unimportant? No. If you don't take care of those things, there will inevitably be sickness. And if we don't take care of the things that I was just telling you about, the humanitarian efforts by which America expresses our own moral leadership and our own stand for humanitarian values and democratic values, then we shouldn't be so surprised surprised that everywhere we look, there's a war here and there's an enemy there. We, I believe, could have done much more over the last 50 years to express the best of who we are, and perhaps the worst of other people might not have had its way with us quite so horribly.
If you're the commander-in-chief, would you be willing to use nuclear weapons?
Oh, nuclear weapons is very difficult. I would be willing to do anything necessary to save the American people. I cannot imagine, however, a case where a nuclear weapon does anything but to cause more danger to the American people.
How about defense spending? There's a lot that you want to get done on the domestic side, and I think necessarily you've described some cuts you'd like to make. What about places like the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard here in New Hampshire that maintains the U.S. submarine fleet? Would we see reductions impact there?
Well, I wouldn't say at this point, as a candidate particularly, what I would, whether or not I would want to close one particular military operation. Obviously, we have to have adequate military operations in order for reasonable protection of our country. But let's be very clear. There is military spending in this country that is way beyond what the military has even asked for. There is terrible bloat there that I don't blame on the military. I blame on the fact that politicians, because they're advocating more for defense contractors than for an agenda of actual creation of peace on this planet in the next 30 or 50 years. Yes, I do see bloat that has nothing to do with reasonable military preparedness. What that means in terms of a particular military installation, I'm not prepared to say at this time. But in terms of our military budget of $718 billion this year alone, particularly as compared with how little in comparison we spend on those humanitarian efforts that create peace, yes, I think there's a terrible imbalance there. And when I'm president, there will be a robust relationship of partnership, such as we have not seen between the State Department and Defense. We need a United States Department of Peace, and we need our Secretary of State to be a world-class humanitarian and diplomat, not the ex-CEO of a multinational fossil fuel company.
Since you're coming at this as an outsider, are there any former presidents or international leaders to whom you would compare your leadership style?
Well, I don't know if it might be presumptuous to compare, but I can tell who I would try to emulate. And that's certainly, at this time, I think FDR has a lot of resonance. The way he created the New Deal. We need right now a fundamental and even massive infusion of economic hope into the veins of our civilization in the form of universal health care, and quickly, raising the minimum wage, and quickly, canceling, if not radically renegotiating these college loans, and quickly, and making college available and free to everyone, and quickly. He saw this kind of need for massive effort in terms of taking us out of the Depression. I see a need for massive effort in order to stave off what could otherwise be an economic catastrophe. Now, the other person, the person who's living, is the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, who said that she wants to make New Zealand the best place for a child to live. And she said, I'm not saying the best place to raise a child, I'm saying the best place for a child to live. And I look forward to calling her up and saying, girlfriend, you are on, because we're going to have a fierce competition on that one.
Do you think that you're going to get a fair shot at the same kind of moment that we see Andrew Yang or Pete Buttigieg having because you're a woman?
You know, I'm not going to go into whining. I'm not going to go into, they don't let me, they're locking me out. I'm seeing people such as yourselves. I'm seeing real journalists, especially on the local levels, but it's starting. I have my CNN town hall, and I feel there's a lot of people have said to me, I came in here, Marianne who, and I'm leaving Marianne Wow. All I'm asking is a fair shot. I'm grateful to those who are giving it to me, and I feel that when I'm given a fair shot, people are smart and they're hearing me, and I feel heard.
Your base is in California, home base, that is.
No. No, I lived in the last 2 years, I've lived in New York.
Okay.
And now I'm living in Des Moines, Iowa.
Well, there you go.
Hello.
You're going to plant yourself there. Do you see yourself as more of an Iowa candidate or a New Hampshire candidate?
When you're running for president, you are surrendered to a suitcase. You know, it's interesting, though. I was born and raised in Texas. And in terms of the way I feel, I've lived most of my adult life in California. I've lived a lot in New York. I raised my daughter in Michigan, and I was born and raised in Texas. So I just feel American.
Do you believe in the idea of American exceptionalism?
The ideals are exceptional, but you can't say just because our ideals are exceptional that we are necessarily embodying them. We have to embody and actualize those ideals in every generation, or we can't say America is exceptional in that generation. Hopefully, even in a generation where we're not, the next generation will pick it up again. The ideals are exceptional, yes. Are we behaving that way right now in terms of our domestic and international policy? I'm so afraid not at all, because we're too often and in too many ways not aligned with the exceptionalism of our ideals.
Marianne Williamson, we thank you for your time on Close Up, and we'll see you out there on the campaign trail.
Thank you so much.
All right.